Lamed Zayin Amud Beis 37b, towards the bottom of the page. We'll learn the whole Gemara. We'll look at Rashi, we'll look at Tosfos, and then we'll get to the halacha. Okay, so the Mishnah, which brought us to the discussion of Tefillin, Mezuzah, and Sefer Torah, even though this chapter is not about that. This tractate, is Menachot. Menachot literally is offerings in the temple that are made of grain. Any offering in the temple made of grain is called Menachot. Usually made of matzah, lechem, the omer, the lechem, shtei lechem, the carbon toida. Some even ordinary offerings had along with it some grain. Any grain-related offering is Menachot. So how did we get to Tefillin Mezuzah in this chapter? Because the Gemara talked about, because the Mishnah was on the discussion of the Beis Hamikdash, so it talked about the menorah. And in the menorah, when it talked about the halachas of the menorah, it mentioned that all 7 branches constitute one mitzvah. That's what we began this whole discussion with. That was the first couple of classes on the menorah, the uniqueness of the menorah's oneness, which brought up other mitzvahs that are made of one, that are parts of one. The 4 parshas of the Tefillin is one mitzvah to have all 4 parshas, even though head and hand are separate mitzvahs. Mezuzah, likewise, the 2 parshas are one mitzvah, and moreover, each word and each letter comprise the whole one mitzvah. If you're missing one letter, it's not as if you have 99 mitzvahs minus the one mitzvah. I don't know how many letters there are in Mezuzah, but I'm just making up a number. But rather, all of them are one. So the last item on the list of things that are one mitzvah comprised of a few elements is tzitzis. That all 4 corners are one mitzvah. It's not 4 different mitzvahs. It's one mitzvah. And there we had a dispute where Rabbi Shmuel said, no, it's 4 separate mitzvahs. Each corner, each tzitzis, each one bringing another mitzvah. Excuse me. Just a word on terminology. It's important to know this. Whenever the halacha says TALIS, in classic vernacular, in common vernacular, in common speech, when you say TALIS, you mean what you wear by davening, the big one. And when you say tzitzis, you mean the small one that you wear under your shirt every day. But in halacha, that's not what it means. In halacha, when you say TALIS, it means the garment, and tzitzis means the fringes, the strings. So the mitzvah is to put tzitzis on your talis. Talis being a garment. I think literally talis actually means like a drape or a cloak. It can be used even as, sometimes the Gemara talis means a blanket. It's just a 4-cornered piece of cloth, right? That's what a talis is. And then tzitzis, the mitzvah is to put tzitzis on that 4-cornered talis. So just a note on that terminology that's going to come up.
How does the halakha refer to talis katan then?
Exactly that. Talis katan, small talis. Talis gadol, big talis.
Okay.
Talis just meaning a garment. And tzitzis is the actual fringes. Okay. So lam begins with the word lavan, and then there's 2 dots after the word sohov, and then we have the word arba tzitzis. So this is from the Mishnah, arba tzitzios, the 4 tzitzis singular, tzitzios plural, the 4 fringes, the 4 strings, the 4 sets of strings. Ma'akva zu hold each other back. That is to say, all 4 are one mitzvah. Sharba asa mitzvah achas, because all 4 of them are one mitzvah. It's not 4 different mitzvahs that you're obliged to do. It's one mitzvah to have 4 strings. And then the Gemara then the Mishnah said that Rabbi Shmuel disagrees and says that it's actually 4 different mitzvahs. So the Gemara asks, "My benayah, what's the difference if it's 4 mitzvahs or 1 mitzvah?" Either way, the Torah requires to have all 4 of them. So what's the difference if it's 4 mitzvahs or 1 mitzvah? So Amar Yosef said, the Gemara now is going to list 3 different distinctions as to whether 3 different practical distinctions, 3, right? As to whether or not it's 1 mitzvah or 4 distinct mitzvahs. So number 1, sadin pitzitzis, ike benayu. The distinction would be if the talis, if the garment is made of linen, and then the strings are of wool, the tzitzis themselves are of wool. So that is a violation of a prohibition of shatnez. Right? There's the prohibition of mixing wool and linen, weaving wool and linen in a garment. So but however, the rule is, generally speaking, that positive commandments override a violation. So the classic example is doing karbanos in Beis Hamikdash. It's a violation of Shabbos, even though there's an assay and a loisa there, but that's just an example, just to illustrate the point, even though it's not 100% accurate, just to illustrate the point. Torah says don't do X, Y, and Z on Shabbos, but then the Torah says do X, Y, and Z in the temple. So you do it, even though it's in violation of Shabbos. So that's generally the rule. So Torah says to put on tzitzis, that's a positive commandment. Torah says don't do shatnez, that's a violation. So the tzitzis override that. So now what happens if I have a 4-cornered garment, but I only have 3 tzitzis hanging? So I have a proper talis, but only 3 tzitzis hanging from them. Now I'm in violation of the commandment of mixing wool and linen. Now, if all 4 are 1 mitzvah, good morning. If all 4 are 1 mitzvah, then there's no commandment here that overrides the prohibition. I'm just a violation of shatnez. But if it's 4 different distinct mitzvahs, then I'm doing 3 out of the 4 mitzvahs. So with each string, I'm doing a mitzvah, and therefore overrides the violation. So I haven't fulfilled all 4 mitzvahs because I'm missing 1 of the 4 tzitzis, but 3 of them I'm doing, and therefore even though they are shatnez, it's still okay because I'm doing the mitzvah, at least 3 of them. However, if all 4 are 1 mitzvah, then I'm not doing any mitzvah, and therefore I'm in violation, I'm wearing shatnez. One distinction. Rav bar Ahina Amar, Rav son of Ahina says, another distinction is, talis balas chomish ikibanayu. A talis, meaning a garment, that has 5 corners, is where the distinction is. The Gemara mentions later in the next chapter that the Torah says a garment of 4 corners is required to have tzitzis. It means anything at least 4 corners. So if it has 5 corners, you're still obligated to have tzitzis. Still obligated to have tzitzis even if it has 5 corners. Now the question is, you make 5 corners if you cut one of them on an angle. If one of them is on an angle, you'll have 5 corners, 5 edges. Right? So, which means, so now let's think about this. We have a 5-corner garment. The Torah says it's not, the Gemara says later that it's not excluded. So it's required to have tzitzis. But how many tzitzis do you have to have? 4 or 5. So if you're of the view like Rabbi Shmuel that each of the tzitzis are a separate mitzvah, then that means each corner is required to have tzitzis. You have 5 corners, have 5 tzitzis. Whereas the Tanna Kama, the original opinion says that all 4 are 1 mitzvah, so how do you ever have a 5th one? You can't have a 5th one. Now the halacha remains that all 4 are 1 mitzvah. And therefore, if you have a 5-cornered garment, you only have, or 6 or 7, you only have 4 tzitzis. Which of the 4 do you do? The ones that are farthest apart from each other. But here's the interesting thing. Because we rule, because the halacha rules, not in accordance to Rabbi Shmuel, but we rule that all 4 are 1 mitzvah. And therefore, if you have a 5, 6, 7-cornered garment, you only have 4 tzitzis. If you were to put on a 5th, you would be a violation of Baal Tosef. There's a commandment, a prohibition against adding to the mitzvahs. We've mentioned this prohibition a number of times. So here you're putting on a 5th tzitzis, you're literally adding to the mitzvah for the sake of the mitzvah, right? That was one of the requirements for the violation, is that you're doing it for the sake of the mitzvah. So here you're clearly doing it for the sake of the mitzvah. You're adding a 5th or a 6th tzitzis. So you'd be in violation of the prohibition against adding to mitzvahs. And therefore, the Alter writes that one should therefore not make, I don't think this is his original opinion, but I'm reading it from, what?
Don't make
a garment that has 5 corners. Because if you only have 4 corners, only have 4 tzitzis, what you're supposed to do, according to Rabbi Shmuel, you're not fulfilling your obligation. Because according to Rabbi Shmuel, you have to have a 5th tzitzis. But if you do follow Rabbi Shmuel, you're in violation of Baal Tosef according to halacha. You're in violation of adding to the mitzvah. According to our view, that's all 1 mitzvah. And therefore never have a garment more than 4 corners. That's the halachic suggestion to avoid
any machloket.
To avoid either not fulfilling the commandment of tzitzis according to Rabbi Shmuel, or being in violation of Baal Tosef according to Tanna Kama. Clear?
Mm.
Is it still a valid talis though? If it has a fifth corner and tzitzis on it?
According to Rabbi Shmuel, it's a valid talis.
No,
but according to halacha, you're in violation of Baal Tosef.
Right, but
Maybe you'll have fulfilled the commandment of tzitzis. I'm not even sure if you did that. I'm not even sure if that counts, but you've certainly violated the commandment of adding to the mitzvahs.
Yeah.
Right.
So you can't do it.
But it doesn't necessarily invalidate the talis, right?
I don't know. Like, could you make a bracha on such a thing? I don't know. I don't know. Could you make a bracha on a tefillin that has 5 parshas, which is another classic example of adding to the mitzvahs? I don't know. Are you allowed to do it? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the rules and regulations about Tosef are. Like, does it invalidate the mitzvah? I don't know. I think it does, but I'm not sure. Do you know anything?
I have to look up,
Leave it open-ended. I'll have a look, God willing. I'll look up in the Talmud, God willing, later.
This is the reason for it.
Sure. It's a Kabbalistic idea. Okay, so that's the second distinction between whether or not you say that tzitzis are one mitzvah or 4 different mitzvahs. Now, a third distinction. Okay, Ravina says, the distinction between the 2 opinions, whether or not the mitzvah is 4 different mitzvahs or one mitzvah, the distinction would come down to a case of mentioned by Rav Huna. What did Rav Huna say? Rav Huna said, a person who walks down with a talis, a garment, that doesn't have the 4 tzitzis, doesn't have the strings, kilachasa properly, the Shabbos on Shabbos, chayav chatos is in violation of the commandment of Shabbos. How so? So, on Shabbos, not allowed to carry. Right? So, you're allowed to wear your clothing. So, if you had something hanging on your clothing that you don't want, or actually, better still, you want them, but right now they're useless. Actually, put it more accurately. If you don't want them, it's batel. At least, depending on how. But if you want them, but they're useless right now, then you're carrying. So now let's say if you have a 4-cornered garment,
yes,
and you have only 3 tzitzis hanging,
one is torn, for example.
One is gone.
It's gone.
You only have 3 tzitzis. So are those 3 tzitzis useful to you or not?
No.
If you are of the opinion that it's one mitzvah, then they're useless to you, and you're carrying and you're violating Shabbos by carrying those 3 extra strings, which are useless to you. Unless you're an Erev. Here we're talking about Hayotzim means going out into a public domain.
Before.
But no, Hayotzim means going out into a public domain. So you're actually going to a real public domain, not even a Carmelist, not even a rabbinic place, like a real public domain. You're going to a highway, let's say, which is a public domain by all accounts. But if you're of the view that each mitzvah, each of the 4 strings are a separate mitzvah, then you're doing 3 mitzvahs. Then those 3 tzitzis hanging are still useful to you, and thus you're not in violation of Shabbos. So there's a third distinction between the 2 views. Okay. Having raised the issue of garments that have more than 4 corners and what constitutes a corner, the Gemara now mentions another case. Amr Rav Shisha b'rei Rav Idi. Rav Shisha said to Rav Idi, "Hi man, this person, the batzil glima that cuts his corner on an angle, thus turning his 4-cornered garment into a 5-cornered garment. Like Ovid v'lay klum, he didn't save himself anything. You know, he tried cutting the corner because he wants to make himself not obligated in tzitzis. He hasn't saved himself anything. Because Shaveh Talas Balas Chomesh, he made a garment that has 5 corners, and as we mentioned, the garment that has 5 corners is still obligated in tzitzis. So you haven't done anything by cutting the corner, which is why if you look closely at kapatus, the back will be rounded.
You can make 5 corners. Impossible.
Again, if you cut,
minimum, 5,
it's very simple.
Minimum 4.
Here. This is a 4-cornered paper.
Yeah.
If I cut right here at the corner, so now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 because I cut it down here
In the angle.
at an angle. So the kapatis, that the Chassidim wear on Shabbos, if you look at the back, one of the coattails, is that what they're called, are rounded, not cut at an angle, because that would make 5 corners, then we'd still have tzitzis. They're rounded, so it only has 3 corners for that reason. Okay, so if you cut it at an angle, you haven't done anything because you're still obligated in tzitzis. Further stated, this seems easy.
If there is 4 corners, you don't put tzitzis.
Sorry?
The kapota.
If it has 4 corners, you need tzitzis, which is why one of them is rounded. Okay. Amarav Misharsh, it has to go up at least halfway, the corner, not partially, but when we get to the next chapter, we'll deal with that. Okay, Amarav Misharshia says, Hi man, this person, decided Laglima, who folded up his cloth, his garment, like Aviv Klum, didn't do anything. Okay, so what does this mean? He folded up his garment. So Rashi gives one version, and then later gives a second version, and Taisus writes, well, why did you give the first version? When the first version, like Rashi himself admits later, is a contradiction to a Gemara later. Namely, Rashi's first version is as follows. If you have a very, very long garment, so you took the bottom, and you folded it up, and stitched it together. So now you have new corners. The new corners are at the fold. Right? So the Gemara is stating that if you did that, you haven't done anything. You haven't done anything. And the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? The command the shayir dummy. We consider it as if it's not folded, because anyway it's going to end up being loose. It'll be loosened later, so we don't consider that stitching to be a valid stitching. Right? So that's what Rashi first says. In other words, if you have a long garment, and then you want to visualize it. You get a long garment. This is the paper, and you fold it up like that. Just fold it like this. So now these were your old corners, and now you have new corners here. Yeah. So it says the Gemara, you didn't do anything. This is Rashi's first version. Why didn't you do anything? It's going to end up being unfolded. So even if it's folded and stitched there, where would you put the tzitzis in this version? You put them at the original corners, even though they're folded up, not at the old ones. Okay.
They're the permanent corners.
Because they're the permanent corners, yeah. However, as Rashi himself points out in the next page in the second version, and Tosfos writes, I don't know why he did this when he himself points out that this is a contradiction. The Gemara in a few pages is going to tell us that if you stitched up in such a fashion, you actually put the tzitzis on the new corner, not the old ones. So what's this case here where you're stitched it up and lost your corner? Where you stitched it up and you haven't lost your corner. So what it means is, as Rashi explains later, and this is the halacha is, that you stitched the edge, you took the edge, you folded it like that. You stitched the edge, folded it like that, but you stitched it in such a fashion where the end becomes round.
Mm.
So by stitching it, you rounded it. Not that you made new corners, that would, as the Gemara says later, you would actually put this on the new corners. But if you stitched it in such a fashion where it's round, this is what the Gemara is telling us here, we don't validate that stitching, and you still need to put this on that corner. So let's go with that version, because that remains the halacha, even though Rashi first gives this other option and then switches back. So let's read the Gemara now using that new version. The halachic version and the second version of Rashi.
But Rabbi,
Yeah.
when you fold it like here, this is already the fourth one. You have 5 and 6.
So the new case is where the person rounded the edges.
Where 5
Where,
and 6.
where he rounded it. So there's no corner. He stitched it
If
round.
you don't round it,
So it only
you
has,
have
one second. One second. So it only has one corner. So it says the Gemara that we don't validate the stitching, and you still have to put this on the old corner. Which means even if you did it like, even if you did it like this,
Yes.
the point is, if you've done only a corner, we don't validate the stitching, and you have to put this on the original corner, even though you have new ones because of your stitching. We consider your stitching to be useless and nothing. We ignore it.
Okay.
We make as if it never was there. And that's what the Gemara is saying now. So let's see. Meshashia says, Haiman the one who stitched up the corner, thus eliminating his corner by his stitching, didn't do anything. My time was the reason. To command the Shayadami, we consider it as if it's never stitched and as if it's hanging in its corner. So you got to put this on that corner anyway. The Tanan, and the Gemara cites a proof to this. Tanan Ami learned also, Kol Chantes Hatzirures, all, I think it's leather pouches. Hatzirures that are stitched at the bottom. In other words, so there's different types of leather, like they used to have leather drinking pouches. I think it's made out of leather. Yeah, they used to have these leather drinking pouches. Like a traveling canteen was made out of leather. So there's two ways to do it. One is where you have 2 pieces of leather and you stitch it at the bottom. So there the Gemara says that's not considered a valid, it's just Titus, it's pure. It's not a valid only a keli, only that which is qualified as a utensil is susceptible to impurity. So because these ones are 2 items that are stitched together, it's not considered a proper keli because it's going to be undone. So same thing here. We don't consider your stitching in the corner to be real stitching because it's going to be undone. Chutz, with the exception of Michel Arvayim, with the exception of the Arab leather pouches, drinking canteens, because Rashi says this is where they always do it. In other words, there are those, or more, I guess, outside of the Arab lands, the way most people make their pouches is they take a piece of leather and fold it and stitch it at the top. So the bottom is not stitched to ever open. So that's a proper utensil. But if you did 2 pieces of leather and stitched it at the bottom, that's not a proper utensil. It's going to open up. Whereas the Arabs, for some reason, that's how they always do it, and therefore that is considered a proper utensil for them. Right?
According to Rashi, they're only...
So they're only tied, they're only knotted, they're not stitched.
Yeah.
Sorry, so it's not knotted, it's stitched.
Yeah, that's
It doesn't really match up with our Gemara, which is why it's a little bit
exactly the same thing, but it's a concept.
Yeah. The point is, even though right now it's used as a utensil, because it's going to be opened, we don't consider it to be closed. And the same thing here at the corner. Okay. Okay, let's finish the Gemara. Let's finish the Gemara. Rabbi Shmuel says, The Mishnah said that the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel says that all 4 garments, all 4 tzitzis are considered one mitzvah and not 4 different pieces. Amar Vuda Mar Shmuel, Vuda said the name of Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Shmuel, halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel. But the Gemara comments that actually we don't follow that. As I mentioned before, we say that they're all one mitzvah, and therefore if you're missing one tzitzis, that would be considered carrying on Shabbos. I'll see you later, God willing. Okay. Gemara, sorry? Where I skipped that?
Yeah. We finished with the...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, with the one of the Arabs.
You skipped one line.
Sorry, I skipped one line.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes. What?
You should put it at tzit.
Yeah. Rav Dimir of Narada said, Haiman the Chachil Glima, this person who, again, the same case, he folded his talis, thus and stitched it, thus ruining a corner, like Aviv, like Klum, didn't do anything, because in Isa, if you want to shorten your talis, or you want to get rid of a corner, lemon boil lipstick l'shadir, you got to cut it off. In other words, stitching it up doesn't help, either in the original version of Rashi. If you want to shorten your talis, folding it in half doesn't work, and stitching it, you have to cut it. But as we said, the Gemara will say later that folding it in half, you still have to put tzitzis on the new corners, so that can't be the case here. But we're talking about the corner. If you wanted to get rid of a corner, thus making yourself not obligated in tzitzis, you have to actually cut it out in a round circle and not just stitch it up in a round circle.
Excuse me, if you have your talis outside, tzit,
Yeah.
You fold it to kiss them.
So
you make another 4 corners anyway.
No, we're talking about stitching it. Someone stitched it, not folded for half a minute. But even so, even so.
Anyway, the first when you
Even so, one of the reasons why there's this idea of having a bendel, what we call in Yiddish, or a small gartel, holding your tzitzis under your shirt, is that it retains the amma. You want your garment, the talis, to retain an amma, to retain its required length. If it's folded all day long, it's a problem. So you tuck it into your pants and you stretch it out, it'll be straightened. Or if you wear, like Siddim will wear a bendel, a small gartel under their shirt to hold their tzitzis in place. But that's not related to the discussion right now. That maybe we'll get to when we get to the next parak in the future. Okay, so now we get to the line. Bishmol Amr. Bishmol says, Abbas and Abba mitzvahs, all 4 of them are 4 different distinct mitzvahs, as opposed to one mitzvah divided into 4 parts. Amr of Huda Marav, who said the name of Shmuel, halacha kabishmol, halacha follows bishmol, that there are 4 separate mitzvahs. But the Gemara comments, the halacha does not follow this view. The halacha follows the view that it's all 4 one big mitzvah, and all the ramifications mentioned before are valid. As to say, the main primary one is the shatness issue, and likewise, if you have a talis, with only 3 tzitzis, that would be considered carrying on Shabbos, because those 3 tzitzis are useless to you. They're not an actual mitzvah until you have all 4. The details of that are pretty interesting, because if they're bottled to your garment, then they're bottled, they're not considered carrying. Meaning, if they're so useless that you'll never want them again, then it's not considered carrying, because it's nullified to your garment. It's only considered carrying when those strings will be useless to you when you later will be useful to you when you later fix it. Namely, it's useful to you, but right now it's not serving any purpose. Then it's considered carrying. And the halachas that are very interesting. To what point do we say it loses its viability for later? So the basic classic example for this is if you have all 3 valid tzitzis, the 4th one's missing. So what, you're going to throw out the other 3? Why would you do that? You just put a new tzitzis on the corner. A new string, a new set of knots. So the other 3 you still have are certainly things you want, but right now they serve no purpose. That is real carrying, where you're carrying something that you want, but right now serves no purpose. And it doesn't serve as a clothing, primarily. It doesn't serve the purpose of a clothing, and therefore it constitutes carrying. Okay, maybe we'll stop over here, and tomorrow we'll finish the Gemara and get to the halacha. Have a wonderful day, buddy.